Just wanted to check for the people in the back here. Yeah. Okay, good. And also, just when you're all dying to Google me afterwards, my name's Marcus Pibworth. But also the Ministry of Change, you can find me. And hello. What I'm going to do, I'll do a little bit of an introduction to who I am and what I do. But I also, my main thing I do is a storyteller. And I was thinking about this sort of meta talk about what storytelling and why I do, and I thought, why don't I just actually tell you one of the stories that I tell to people? So that's what I'll do. But I'll just say at the beginning, I started this project just over 2 years ago, Ministry of Change, and it's true, I drive around in my red camper van, and it started as a way of exploring my own experiences with depression. And I thought, when I got to a point, I thought, the best way I can think of doing this is to go out and speak to other people about how they experience life. And so that I started off not really knowing what that meant or how to do that, and I just started, and it eventually turned into a podcast which I talk to people, but then also the main thing is storytelling. I create workshops around storytelling, and I found that to share your experiences of life does something very powerful, something very healing, I think. It stops it being just your experience. I think when you're holding something inside, it becomes all encompassing. But when you manage to let it out and share it, it stops being your story. And I think it re-enters the sea of human experience and becomes everybody's story. And that, I think, is really powerful and healing to yourself, but also to other people. And so I just really try and encourage people to share and talk about things. And so I'm going to go into the story. And I guess one of the aims of what I do is I try and make topics that aren't necessarily always seen as accessible, more accessible. And so I like to take people on a journey down somewhere where they don't usually like to go. But then I think the important thing is not to leave them there. So I try and bring you all back. So hopefully, anyway, I'll go into it. So yes. And I picked this particular story because it takes place in a city called Brighton. And I'm sure, as we are in Brighton, many of you will know it is a city by the shore and a city with a beach. And this particular story took place just down the road from here, in between the two piers. From where I was standing on that day, I could see both of them. To my left was the Palace Pier, its neon lights flickering, unperturbed by the drizzly January weather. The Palace Pier is a symbol of fun. It's a symbol of a city where you can really let your hair down. It's a symbol of a city where you're encouraged to celebrate your weirdness and to shout about it from the rooftops. That is the Brighton that I arrived in 2005 as a fresh-faced undergraduate. It was a Brighton of sex and drugs and dancing on the beach under the moonlight after the clubs had kicked out. Palace Pier. And then on my right was the West Pier, a burnt out metal shell standing by itself, alone in the sea. The West Pier had already fallen into a state of disrepair and burnt down 2 years before I arrived in the city. The West Pier grows smaller each year as it's battered by the winter storms. The West Pier, perhaps another symbol of Brighton. A symbol of a city that's partied too hard. A symbol of a city of homelessness A city rough around the edges, a city of huge disparity between rich and poor. A symbol of a city that has sometimes perhaps lost its way. The West Pier. And on that day, as I stood on the beach, I felt a lot more like the West Pier than I did the Palace Pier. If I was really honest with myself, that whole year leading up to this day, I felt a lot more like a West Pier kind of year. I had been weighed down by depression, and every ounce of my energy was put into just getting out of bed and existing. And on that particular day, the world felt even heavier than other days. And I got out of bed, I put on my Doc Martens, my black jeans, my heavy winter coat, and I'd left the apartment and gone down to the beach. I stood there, staring out at the horizon. During the summer, you can't move on Brighton Beach for people. There's people everywhere having picnics, barbecues, deck chairs, beach towels. Every inch of those pebbles is taken up. But on this wet winter day, there was nobody else on the beach. Not another soul as far as the eye could see. Just me standing there alone. And as I stared out over the horizon, I had just one thought, one question going round and round and round in my head. There is but one truly philosophical problem, said Albert Camus, the French existentialist writer. And that problem is suicide. To answer this question, whether life is or is not worth living, is to answer the most fundamental question in philosophy. Whether the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, these are just games. First, one must answer this. Or, as Hamlet put it a little bit more succinctly, to be or not to be? That was my question. Whether to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or by facing a sea of troubles and opposing end them. What was the point? What was the point of all this? As I stood and stared at the horizon, the sea had begun to recede a little bit, but I knew that in a few long strides I could be in the sea, embraced by the cold clutches of the English Channel. It could all be over so soon. Crunch, 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 crunch. Suddenly, my existential crisis was thrown into disarray. Down the beach came marauding a gang of Italian exchange students. They laughed and joked. They passed around cans of Carling. One of them had a speaker under his arm. And they walked down the beach and they stopped right in front of me. Right in front of me. There was no one else on this whole beach as far as the eye could see, and they stopped in front of me. I was so angry. I thought about going over there and giving them a piece of my mind. Did they not know that they were interrupting my conversation with Camus and Shakespeare? But I didn't go over there. I just looked at them and sighed. And I turned around and I began to stomp angrily off the beach. But I turned around to give them all one last angry look. As I did that, something changed. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a smile dropped from the sky onto my face. As I looked at this scene, something in the absurdity of this situation connected with the absurdity of all of this. Something in the world made sense. And as I left the beach, I no longer felt in despair. I no longer felt angry. I had a big grin on my face, and I left the beach, thinking to myself, not today, Camus. Not today. Perfect.